is nuclear disarmament the way we should be thinking about how this world should survive and get rid of nuclear weapons? We find in the new set of nuclear armed states that have come up, there are new sensibilities about how they look at nuclear deterrence. The postures are different, the doctrines are different. The sense of whether risks are good for deterrence or bad is also different, because there are many countries that believe that risks are actually good, that they enhance deterrence. So in this kind of situation then, how do we examine the questions of deterrence and disarmament and where we want to be in the next, some decades? So to address these questions, I have an excellent panel with me, perhaps the best in the sessions in the conference. Right next to me is Mariana Bucherian. She's a senior research associate with the project on managing the atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Right at the end there is Ambassador Alexander Kement. He's the Director of Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Department of the Austrian Foreign Ministry. Right next to him is Melanie Roselle, is the Director for Strategy and Policy at the French Atomic Energy Commission. And here in the center is Michiru Nishida, who's a professor at the School of Global Humanities and Social Sciences at Nagasaki University. So as you can see, we've got a varied set of experience and expertise with us. The detailed bios are on the app that all of you, I'm sure, have downloaded. I could only do justice, with a line for their introduction. But we have a lot of ground to cover. And I'm going to start by posing my first question to you, Mariana. Your book on nuclear disarmament of Ukraine is just about to be published. So you are best suited to help us understand the argument that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, not just of Soviet vintage, but of its own built over a period of time, it could have not been attacked in the manner in which it has been. So do you think more states will reach this conclusion that having nuclear weapons, when you have a hostility with a nuclear weapon state, you need nuclear weapons of your own? So is nuclear proliferation on the anvil, do you think?
Right, that's a very important question and one that I get asked a lot these days. But before I launch into trying to discern it, as many of you know, I am Ukrainian. There's some of my compatriots that sit in this conference. I cannot speak on behalf of the Ukrainian people, but for what it's worth, I want to thank each and every one of you who have contributed your thoughts, your tax dollars, your analysis, your concern to my country and the plight of its people in this hour of need. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. So the counterfactual of Ukraine possibly having a nuclear deterrent and whether it would work. For one, social scientists with historical awareness, I should say, or historically tuned in social scientists are very wary of counterfactuals because they might paint the world of, say, Ukraine exactly the way it is today, only with nuclear weapons. And that's, of course, not the way history works. Ukraine would have been an entirely different country had it launched a program to convert this nuclear inheritance that it got from the Soviet Union into its own nuclear deterrent. It would have had to summon immense economic resources, withstand international opprobrium, survive into independent sovereign adulthood under that kind of pressure, and also strategically make sure that it has survivable second strike capability versus an enormous nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. But I have to say, assuming that that could be done, assuming that somehow Ukraine could have mustered this feat, it's hard to argue that somehow nuclear deterrence would work differently for Ukraine or than it works for France or for UK or for the United States, if we assume that nuclear deterrence works. What I see happening right now in this war, and the role of the nuclear factor in this war is that, yes, the conflict is constrained, the war is constrained in the original territory with the original two belligerents. It has not spilled over east to west. So whether it is the working of nuclear deterrence, that will be a big question that the scholars will have to peruse. I think it is a safe thing to assume that nuclear deterrence does do some work in restraining this conflict and keeping it bound to Ukrainian territory that is not covered by nuclear deterrence, neither of its own or of that of a patron, of an ally. The nuance of Ukraine's disarmament story notwithstanding, and there's a great nuance, and there will be a book that will hopefully shed light on some of it. The optics of this situation are awful. There you had a country that had a nuclear option, that had a claim to that nuclear option as a legitimate successor state of the defunct Soviet Union. It decides to disarm in exchange for nuclear assurances pledged by nuclear weapon states, including the Russian Federation, and gets in turn invaded and disseminated by one of the assurers, let's put it that way. And even if Ukraine prevails at a cost of its grit, with the help of Western weapons, even if it, stands its ground versus a nuclear weapon state, Russia, none of the thousand fails still against a nuclear armed adversary, but to avoid that situation in the first place.
Very right. I think we all understand that what was seen to be, in the case of Ukraine, a success in the disarmament side, suddenly, it's brought us home the fact that nuclear deterrence does matter when you're facing a hostility from a nuclear weapon state. So since we're talking about nuclear disarmament, let me bring in Ambassador Alexander here. Now, it's paradoxical that on the one hand, we have the Treaty on
Recording in progress.
Or we try a clear rejection of nuclear weapons, of threats with nuclear weapons, use with nuclear weapons, and because of the unacceptable risks and the consequences which would be shared by everyone. So nuclear deterrence, I mean, it assumes non-use, but it is based on the credibility and readiness to use. So how exactly would these weapons be used in this scenario? Against whom? What are the targets? How to deal with the global consequences? That's the conversation, I think, that can propel us more into the discourse on disarmament. So I think the line between responsible threat with nuclear weapons and irresponsible threats with nuclear weapons, from the perspective of the sort of vast majority of states, is extremely blurred. And so what exactly are responsible threats with nuclear weapons in light of what we know about the consequences and risk of these weapons? So that is, I think, part of the value of the TPNW, because it puts this very much into focus. When all vectors are pointing in one direction, which is extremely dangerous, and the end point of that could be absolutely catastrophic, the TPNW makes the argument for a change of paradigm. I think it's crucial to strengthen, and the value of this treaty right now, crucial to strengthen the taboo against nuclear weapons use. It's also crucial to strengthen this trend towards more proliferation, because of course it makes the stigmatization point. And I think that is often overlooked, the value as a non-proliferation measure of this sets of arguments. And I think, of course, we heard about the assumptions and uncertainties, but there is empirical, demonstrable empirical evidence on the humanitarian consequences, the breadth of them, the interrelationship of them, the fact that we can't deal with them, and we understand risks much better. And that, I think, needs to be weighed against the uncertainties and assumptions on which nuclear deterrence is based. So, I think it's a really important contributions to discuss the legitimacy of the status quo, the ethics of the status quo, and of course intergenerational justice also. So I think that is my short answer. The value of the TPNW right now, it works on the legal plane, and of course that's for the countries that sign and ratify, but it works on a political and discursive plane as well, and I think it couldn't be more important than right now.
Thank you. Melanie, if I can bring you in now. Alexander mentioned the humanitarian consequences, and we all understand the argument that comes from there for moving towards nuclear disarmament. But I want to, question the idea of the utility of nuclear weapons from the military dimension, and whether the Russia-Ukraine conflict has shown us the limits of the military utility of nuclear weapons. To achieve a political objective, is there ever going to be a right target that one can find, which will make you then come out better off, particularly when you're facing a situation where retaliation of some kind is going to be certain? So therefore, what is the utility of nuclear weapons as you see it in the context of the conflict that we are going through?
So first, thank you so much to you and to the Carnegie for the invitation, and to give a French perspective, not necessarily the French official view on these important issues. So to your question, I think nuclear deterrence has been working so far between NATO and Russia. Both Russia and NATO have been deterred from starting a direct confrontation on each other territory. Russia has been forced to accept the support provided by NATO allies to Ukraine without being able to retaliate into NATO's territory or against NATO personnel. And NATO countries on their side have been very careful to support Ukraine, but not to become belligerent in this conflict. So nuclear deterrence has not failed. It has worked where it was supposed to work for NATO, protecting its vital interests enabling it to support Ukraine more and more. And in short, we can say that nuclear deterrence has created a ceiling of violence in this conflict. It prevents a direct confrontation and thus a major war between Russia and NATO so far. Now, of course, it's more of a mixed bag when it comes to Ukraine and what nuclear weapons do that. Russia is practicing in Ukraine what the French nuclear strategists call aggressive sanctuarization. That is, Russia deviates from a strictly defensive deterrent to use nuclear weapons as a tool of intimidation, coercion, enabling Moscow to wage a conventional war of aggression against its neighbor in the shadow of its nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons, or at least nuclear rhetoric, are used in an offensive way to impose a territorial fait accompli and to try to break Ukraine's and Western will and determination to help. So the third point is that it is therefore very crucial to defeat that strategy of aggressive sanctuarization and to demonstrate, as you rightly say, that nuclear weapons cannot and shall not be used in that way, that that nuclear deterrence is for defensive purpose only. So that's what also Russia said in January when it committed to the declaration of the P5. Otherwise, it would set a very dangerous precedent. So to answer your question, in the third nuclear age that we are living through, nuclear deterrence and strong security guarantees from responsible nuclear weapon states will be needed to face the threat posed by potentially disinhibited nuclear states that pursue a revisionist agenda. Nuclear weapons will be part of the problem, there is no denying that, but like it or not, nuclear deterrence will continue to be part of the answer for the foreseeable future and as long as nuclear weapons exist.
So, with the three of them having spoken, we know that nuclear deterrence seems to be the name of the game for the time being. We are stuck with nuclear deterrence. Until we can get to nuclear disarmament, risk reduction then has to be, some of the answers have to be found on the ground of risk reduction. And I want to pose that question now to Michiru. The biggest nuclear risk in the current situation seems to be arising from the fact that there are no strategic dialogues, leading to misperceptions and often worst-case assumptions about adversaries. Now, you have studied the role of nuclear transparency, particularly between US and USSR, Russia. They had a parity which enabled transparency. They were, at the nuclear level, they were largely talking about similar kinds of arsenals and capabilities, and therefore transparency allowed for certain kind of arms control to take place. I want to bring in the issue of China, where China has a nuclear asymmetry, and it believes in the value of ambiguity of deterrence. So in the absence of transparency then, how can nuclear risk reduction be achieved when you want to bring in China into the picture?
Yes, thank you very much for having me today for this important conference. And with regard to the transparency in China, I think the premise that transparency cannot be possible for Chinese nuclear arsenals because of its small size of the nuclear forces may not be so relevant today. Even if we take the argument that because of the small size, transparency may not be possible, is not possible for them. Their nuclear arsenals is growing, and for the last 10 to 20 years. And even if we take their argument, the corresponding, the level of nuclear forces is growing, and as the level of nuclear force is growing, then the level of transparency can be increased to some extent. So for example, so their argument is that if they disclose the number of nuclear warheads, then they would be worried about the U.S. Offensive decapitating cruise strike. Then, you know, even before the parity, they can sort of, for example, go up to the come about with a rough number of aggregate numbers of nuclear holdings. For example, they can say they have like no more than 300 or 400. So, you know, they don't have to disclose the exact number of nuclear holdings. With that, you know, they can still have the margin of some kind of ambiguity that they would like to maintain. But at the same time, they can show their commitment to Article 6 of the NPT Treaty. Because transparency is the basis for any nuclear disarmament. Without transparency, you cannot know whether nuclear weapons state is actually implementing disarmament. Without transparency, we cannot verify anything. So transparency is the first step for nuclear disarmament. So, you know, corresponding level of transparency in correspondence to their level of nuclear forces should be possible. And with regard to nuclear risk reduction, so that's also very important. I mean, transparency is part of nuclear risk reduction. And with regard to China, for the last 10 years or 15 years, I think the US has been trying to engage with the Chinese, but it's not been possible so far. So in that case, the minimum we can do is that to convey the message, the united message that in the peacetime, especially in the peacetime, before crisis starts, that any kind of nuclear sort of blackmail that the Russians are doing may not, should not be done in East Asia. That kind of message of, for example, that could be said as a message of deterrence, but you know, that is forcefully, clearly conveyed or communicated to the Chinese authorities. That's a strategic communication. That kind of strategic communication is very important for nuclear risk reduction. And also, in the peacetime, the close consultations amongst allies is very important because if there's any daylight amongst allies, status quo changing country like China or Russia always try to exploit that daylight. So that kind of close consultations on what is the interest of each ally and what is the objective of any contingency, that's very important for risk reduction as well.
And we've seen negotiations between allies are as difficult as they are with adversaries in several cases. But I wanted to ask you a follow-on question, Michiru, about what do you think are the lessons that are coming out from the Russia-Ukraine conflict in East Asia? We did hear some noises in Japan and South Korea about their wanting to go towards nuclear weapons. Since, making use of the place that you're coming from, can you give us a sense of what is the thinking in Japan and South Korea about the utility of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, so this is exactly what may happen when this kind of nuclear saber rattling happens in the world. In Japan, as soon as nuclear blackmail had started in last February, I think a couple of weeks later, already the debate on nuclear sharing started in Japan, and also in Korea. I think now a lot of discussions on the redeployment of nuclear weapons in the Korean Peninsula. I think this is not helpful, but this is exactly what happens. So there's a linkage between Europe, what can happen in Europe and in East Asia. a lot of security experts in Japan are closely watching the developments in Europe, and especially in terms of deterrence and also in terms of assurance. So what NATO or the US might do, or how they might react to this nuclear blackmail will be seen in East Asia and very closely, and they would watch closely how the Chinese and the North Koreans would perceive how the US and NATO would react to whatever nuclear saber rattle in Europe. So that would affect nuclear debate in East Asia, or nuclear, even for future nuclear proliferation. So this is very important discussion. It's important to, what is happening in Europe will very much affect in East Asia.
Mariana, if I can then draw you into, is non-proliferation sustainable without disarmament? We've seen the NPT, have this whole question about whether the responsibilities of the non-nuclear weapon states have been growing over a period of time, while no movement on disarmament has taken place from the nuclear weapon states. And therefore, the questions come up again and again about how can we make non-proliferation sustainable unless there is movement on disarmament as well? So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, indeed. I mean, that's the crux of the matter, right? The commitment, this Article 6 of the NPT, is one of the main bargains that tries to ameliorate the ultimately a very unequal, unfair, discriminatory system in which some states base their own security on nuclear deterrence, but others are expected to give up that right, right, and provide for their security by other means. That's long-term not a sustainable situation, and we see it today playing out with TPNW coming as a sort of this resistance movement, as it were, to this unjust system. And the progress in Article 6 has been absolutely crucial to reconcile, to at least ameliorate part of this predicament. Of course, with the war in Ukraine, I think it is safe to assume that for the next few years, we're not going to see significant progress on arms control, certainly not between Russia and the United States. Under the best prognostications, perhaps some kind of status quo on the New START could be maintained, and parties might commit to just continue on observing the obligations even after New START expires in 2026. So I see this war having many ramifications for the global nuclear order. None of them are particularly new, right? The Article 6 issue has been with us for a very long time. But it's just these chasms, these tensions will be exacerbated. How they will reverberate through the system, whether that will result in more proliferation, remains to be seen. There are very good arguments out there, and as authors of some of them are present with us today, that say there might not be an immediate wave of proliferation that we can see. Fair enough, but the future is long. 20, 30 years from now, it's hard to predict which country might draw which lessons from the current situation.
So I find several arguments in literature suggesting that proliferation could be good, that it will constrain wars from happening amongst nations. And my concern always with the argument that nuclear proliferation might be a good idea is that you just have to step onto a busy street. And I come from India. I know what those busy streets are like, where you are worried not just about having control on your own vehicle, but the fact that the others must also have control on their vehicle so that there's no inadvertent collision. And if we are getting into this proliferated world, where we have also started rather loosely talking about the idea of limited nuclear war, Melanie, I want to ask you about your thoughts on the idea of limited nuclear war, because I have always felt it's an oxymoron. What is really limited about the use of nuclear weapons? Are we going to count it in terms of the numbers of nuclear weapons used? Is it going to be about the yield of the weapon? Is it about the number of people who die immediately or those that will die over a period of time? How do we understand what is limited nuclear war?
So there's no limited nuclear war. From the French perspective, it's absolutely clear. Nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. So there's, in the French concept, and it should be, and it's also, I think for the P3, the same, and for NATO, nuclear weapons are not weapons of use. They are not there for war fighting. They are there to, they are a political tool to make the calculus of waging a war of aggression irrational, because you will have costs that outweigh in many, many ways the potential benefits. That comes to a point that there is worse than nuclear weapons. There are nuclear weapons without deterrence. And the fact that nuclear weapons were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is horrible, and it took some time to make sure that nuclear weapons and deterrence were the same. That are weapons of political weapons that are there not to be used but to prevent war. And the priority should be to stick to that and not to normalize the perspective of using nuclear war on the battlefield. So I think that where we are today, yeah. I had a word of preparation, but maybe later.
Okay. Alexander, if miraculously the nations were to come to the agreement that disarmament is the way to go, what do you think would be some of the first steps that we should be taking towards that? I mean, you've been part of the TPNW, the Vienna Action Plan was announced by them in their meeting. Are there some pointers there that can get us towards disarmament?
I feel really tempted to respond to some of the points that were raised, if I may. Once again, I want to make the point that it is striking how the perspective of the vast majority of states is disregarded. It's not just a security issue for nuclear armed states and allies. It is a pertinent security issue for the rest of the world. So they have agency, and they have the interpretation of the vast majority of states is that the very practice of nuclear deterrence is at the expense of their security. I think it's really important to, that's the crux of the divide, so to speak. Yeah? And it can be backed up with the arguments of what we actually know what would happen if these weapons are used, because the consequences are global. So this is deeply unjust, and it's a serious security issue for the rest of the world. I mean, my country is surrounded by NATO countries with the exception of Switzerland, but there is a NATO base 50 kilometers south of the border. So if nuclear weapons were to be used, whether we are, I mean, my country would be directly impacted. The same goes for a nuclear war between two nuclear armed states in the northern hemisphere. We know from the research that it can have global impact, food security. What's the justice? And I mean, it is a pertinent security issue from sub-Saharan Africa's perspective. If deterrence fails in the north, between a conflict where African countries have absolutely nothing to do with, and it leads to a famine. So it is a security issue. I really want to reject this armament, this utopian. It's a security necessity from the perspective of the vast majority of states. I think that's important. It's perceived as deeply unjust what's going on. And I think that's the driver. But it's not based on a idealist approach. It's based on a clear security analysis. This is why states parties ratify the TPNW, because they want to push those countries that haven't relied these weapons to try to find a way out of this paradigm, which is, of course, it must be based on international law, it must be based on unequivocal norms, and obviously the way to go is the understanding that because of the consequences and risks, the security calculations behind nuclear deterrence is not quite as safe and stable as is assumed. And I think that is a really important discussion that needs to be had. And all we talk about here all the time is the threat perception between nuclear weapon states and allies. Of course, they are absolutely pertinent, but the perspective of the rest of the world is completely disregarded. And I think that is a really important, if you wonder here what's going on in the NPT, if you wonder where the TPNW comes from, that's the discussion that needs to be had. And I just wanted to make the point, it is seen as illogical to say that nuclear deterrence is for, that nuclear weapons are only for deterrent purposes and cannot be used, because nuclear deterrence relies on the credible readiness to use them. So how credible can a threat be if you say, I'm never going to use them? Of course, you have to make everybody believe that you're going to use them. And that leads to direct security concerns for the rest of the world. I think that's important. So I encourage everyone to have a look at the declaration that TPNW States Parties agreed to in Vienna. Can I just read one short paragraph of it? It says, far from preserving peace and security, nuclear weapons are used as instruments of policy linked to coercion, intimidation, and heightening of tensions. This highlights now more than ever the fallacy of nuclear deterrence doctrines, which are based on and rely on the threat of the actual use of nuclear weapons, and hence the risk of destruction of countless lives, of societies, of nations, and of inflicting global catastrophic consequences. And then, of course, TPNW States Parties insist that pending on the total elimination of nuclear weapons, all nuclear armed states never to threaten or use these weapons under any circumstances. That's the security call from the vast majority of states, which I think is just simply mostly disregarded in this debate. And I think it's really important to engage in this discussion. And if the bridge building or if the poles apart are supposed to be getting closer, there needs to be a discussion that takes this perspective more seriously, and it's just not happening. I think it's really important to change this.
No, thank you, and I think I'm so glad you brought in this perspective, because the paradox of nuclear deterrence is often not understood, that the more you want deterrence to hold, the more you have to have the preparedness to handle deterrence breakdown, and that really can pull you into a cycle of how you think nuclear weapons are usable. In fact, if all of you promise to be very short in your answers, I want to ask a common question to all of you, which is, what if the norm of non-use of nuclear weapons is broken? What do you think will be the impact of the use of low-yield nuclear weapons? Would it conventionalize the use of weapons? Would it set a precedent for others to follow in the future? Because having that norm, I think, does matter. In fact, all this talk that we heard about the dirty bomb, I think it shows the strength of the norm, because Russia is wanting to build up a pretext before it can do something. It wants it to be seen as a legitimate action. So the norm does matter. And if that norm is broken, then would it conventionalize the use of nuclear weapons? Or will it lead to greater abhorrence for nuclear weapons and move towards disarmament? Mariana, let me start with you.
I think it would certainly be the latter. It would be the greater abhorrence and even greater need to figure out what to do in order to prevent that from happening again. But I also see the priority is to prevent this from happening in the first place, right? To enforce this norm of non-use in a space, incidentally, where deterrence is not a factor, right? In Ukraine, for instance. So this is, for me, it's a great kind of case study to test this nuclear taboo that Tannenwald talked about, because she talked about it in the context of deterrence doing the similar work that the nuclear taboo is doing, and therefore it was hard to kind of parse them out. Well, here we have a space in which there is no deterrence, no nuclear deterrence per se, but we're looking at how to enforce a nuclear taboo in Ukraine. And what we're finding out is that it's really difficult. What is it that you can credibly threaten Putin with on behalf of the West, on behalf of Ukraine, in order to dissuade him to go nuclear in Ukraine. I think we find our options wanting. So this is a great time of reckoning for all of us.
Thank you. Michiru, your thoughts on this?
Yes, before coming to your question, I'd like to just echo last comment remarks. I totally agree with you that perspectives of many non-nuclear states have not been highlighted. I think we need to highlight those concerns from the security perspective, as you said, and also humanitarian perspective as well. So I think TPNW is doing a very important work for that. But at the same time, from many security perspective of the many Japanese security experts, we also have very imminent nuclear threats we face. And Japan is probably the country that is faced with the most imminent nuclear threats. Not just those countries that hold nuclear weapons, but countries that are willing to change status quo with nuclear weapons. This is the most important aspect. So I think, as you said, we need to be closer, not close apart, but we need to closer. So I'm glad to hear that you said that perspectives of nuclear weapon states and allies also pertinent. So I think we can have a bridge of bridge building perspective if we respect each other's perspective. And with regard to the norm of non-use, yeah, I think this is a very, very important norm that we have to maintain.
But once it's broken, what do you think will happen?
Yeah, I mean, as Mariana said, it's going to be very serious issue. But I think it could go both ways. Many people would say, nuclear deterrence or nuclear weapons are more important, so we should go nuclear. On the other hand, many people would say this is just so horrible. We should abolish nuclear weapons, and this voice will also be strong. So I think it'll be very, world split. But I think in this current world, the reason that one of the reasons that the world is so united, especially the European countries so united, and the Western countries united to support Ukraine, is not just because of the the very how do you say abstract kind of thing, but because of this horrendous sort of genocidal activity on the grounds by the Russian forces. So the perspective has become more individual, not just a state. So I think that is one of the reasons why so many people are very strongly supportive of Ukraine's fight against the Russians. And if that's the case, then I think nuclear abolition voice may be also very strong, because if the world witnesses the consequence of the use of nuclear weapons on the ground, it's going to be very, very much more severe than what happened in Bucha and other places. So in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for 10 years, there was a press restriction to let what happened on the grounds to the world. So that also sort of was one of the reasons that what exactly happened on the grounds in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not so known. But this time, if it is known, it's going to be spread so fast through SNS and so on. So in that case, it could go either way, but nuclear abolition movement might be stronger.
Sure. Thank you, Melanie.
First, Ambassador, I wanted to give you some perspective. So I respect your point of view and the necessity or the perspective of elimination of the threat posed by nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons. But the objective I think in the longer term, we share this objective. The problem is how do you get there? And it is as important as setting the objective is to create a path in which you make sure that you are not going to trade potential mass destruction for actual mass injustice, which is what would be the case if you had unilateral disarmament of democracies only, of nuclear weapon states that stand to their responsibilities as members of the Security Council. And I think, make no mistake, what would be the consequences of the United States right now unilaterally disarming, or NATO getting rid of their nuclear weapons right now? I think it would be more proliferation, more nuclear weapons, so a bigger problem, more disinhibition from revisionist states, and in the end, more violence, be it conventional or by the use of nuclear weapons. And the second question is, how do you make sure that you do not trade potential mass destruction with nuclear weapons for actual mass destruction with other weapons? And in Ukraine, unfortunately, conventional weapons are killing. And it's another counterfactual, but would Russia have invaded Ukraine? Wouldn't it have invaded Ukraine if it hadn't had nuclear weapons? It is possible that it would have invaded Ukraine anyway. So, in other words, I think it's wrong, even from a security perspective, to disconnect the question of nuclear weapons from the strategic context and the objective from the ways to get there. And in that way, it is wrong to treat nuclear weapons as some states indifferentiated and to make equivalencies between behaviors that are not equivalent. And you quoted the TPNW and the conference. The result of the conference, what struck me is that Russia was not mentioned in the final document. So when you fail to name the problem, I think it's very difficult to solve a problem with when the problem is not properly framed.
Melanie, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a long list of questions which is coming in thick and fast, so we must get to some audience questions.
I come back to your question maybe in another round.
Okay, right. Alexander, to my question, I don't want you to answer.
If the non-use is broken, first of all, I absolutely agree. We must stay on the preventative side of the argument. I think that's we would be in completely uncharted waters. And anybody who thinks that we know what's going to happen, I think is not right, because we simply don't know, and the potential for catastrophic outcomes is extremely bad, is extremely high. The argument that I would make, if, say, Russia breaks that and uses a nuclear weapon, so it would be extremely important to have the strongest international response possible. And the question I'm asking, is the strongest international response more credible if it is linked to a categoric rejection to threatening and using nuclear weapons? And how is that possible if there are nuclear deterrence doctrines which themselves foresee the use of these weapons? I think that's the case at the moment. And I think you would have this debate very much if nuclear weapons were to be used, say one nuclear weapon is used, you would have this debate very much between those who say this is now the moment to finally categorically, which of course is the much stronger reaction, than those who would say, well, this is a responsible act and we are responsible This is an irresponsible act, and that form of deterrence is responsible. It would be a different kind of message. So I hope we're not going to end up having this debate, because then we failed to stay on the preventative side
I hope
of
so
it.
too, yes.
And I just have one response to the, first of all, on the day after the declaration was adopted, the Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement complaining about the declaration. Yeah? So it didn't mention Russia directly, but they felt very much spoken to. And I tell you openly why we didn't mention Russia, because a lot of the TPNW state parties said, well, what about Fire and Fury? Yeah? And what about other cases? So unfortunately, that is my country. We would have liked to be very clear on Russia, and we see this, and we wonder in the West why, when we take this issue to the General Assembly, not everybody votes the way we want. Why isn't it clear to everybody who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? It is not seen that clearly in the rest of the world. I think that's a fact, and it is because of some double standards that simply need to be addressed. I would like to have stronger vote in the GA, but these are facts, and I think it needs to be addressed, and it's also part of the nuclear weapons debate.
So there are several stories there that I'm sure all of us want to listen to, but in the interest of time, I have to get to the questions which have come from the floor, and I think quite a few of them, extremely thoughtful, have also been answered in some of the questions that we raised earlier. So let me start with this question perhaps I can put it to you, Mariana. Usually the never-ending cycle of deterrence, coercion, escalation is ended by reassurance measures, and we saw that also in the Cuban Missile Crisis. What kind of reassurances could be demonstrated by both sides to stop this crisis?
I think we'd be in a better situation if there was a quick answer to it. The parallels with the Cuban Missile Crisis are somewhat fraught, I think, because the differences, I think, are more significant than the similarities between then and today. Putin is no Khrushchev, and Khrushchev did at one point realize he had miscalculated, and he was willing to accept some kind of a deal. I personally don't see any such indication from President Putin and his surrounding today. For Ukraine, it's an existential plight. It's an existential plight, plain and simple. And it's not about wanting more territory than you're entitled to. It's the realization that what we have been seeing from 2014 is salami tactics. So they lobbed off Crimea, so there was some reaction. So then went Donbass, so everyone said no military solution, and at that time probably there wasn't, given the state of Ukrainian military. And they froze the conflict with the Minsk Accords. What happened? That became a ticking time bomb that Russia could set off when it chose to. And so at this point, I think the general kind of sentiment in Ukraine is, this is the time of reckoning. We're not going to push this war to our kids. We'll fight and die today, because at least we have a chance to create a country where our kids are free to shape their own destiny. And so I think it's an utterly unsatisfactory answer, because there isn't. I do not see any potential at this point for a settlement or reassurance or negotiation. Basically, because I don't know what Mr. Putin wants short of the destruction of Ukraine.
Well, in the first panel also, we saw all the panelists struggling to find an answer to that as to what those assurances could be. I have this question now on disarmament, so perhaps, Alexander, I can put it to you. This is about how should we view the continuing advancement of disarmament verification technology. Is the international community ignoring some of the other drivers that we should be looking at for moving towards disarmament, and verification technologies advances is one of them? Is it a force which is pushing us closer towards a pro-disarmament atmosphere?
I'm not a technical expert, but new technologies can have an incredibly positive contribution to verification efforts. I think we have to, when we look at the verification challenge as such, it's more a political one, because we actually know how to do verification. It's difficult as long as verification is conditioned with maintaining strategic stability and nuclear deterrence, because that makes it so difficult. But the technical side of it, I mean, the IAEA knows its job. We now have open source opportunities, so there's plenty on the technical side. Still there are challenges, but obviously the real challenges on verification are not technical, they are political ones.
Melanie, I can pose this question to you because it's about nuclear deterrence, and Stephen Young is asking, given the increased salience of nuclear weapons in Russia and China, the world is a more dangerous place. Yet we are told nuclear deterrence is here to stay, and we did start with that conclusion. Is there a tipping point where the changes and the policymakers agree to, because it's too risky to continue down this path of nuclear deterrence? What might that tipping point be?
I don't think there's, so historically you had the arms control began when after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you had conditions, you had a stalemate on the ground, the two parties considered it, they could not achieve their goals militarily, and there was a very high crisis, and they realized they couldn't go on forever. But that began arms control. That didn't stop the logics of nuclear deterrence. So there is no, I don't think there's a tipping point. There's a miracle solution that would be another solution as what we have right now, which is trying to go for a pragmatic, progressive approach of nuclear disarmament in line with the strategic context, and there is no escaping that. And what I fear personally is that the strong push for abolition will have strategic effects, but only in democracies. Because that push, what the TPNW achieves is a moral stigmatization, but it is asymmetrical. It works where you have civil societies. It works here, where you can have wonderful debates on the gender and the climate dimension, but it doesn't work in North Korea, and I'm not sure TPNW supporters have much success in North Korea or China to make their points. So we must work together, and there is no other solution.
Michiru, if I can ask you this question, this has come from Scott Sagan, and he's asking, won't the proliferation effect of any Russian use of tactical nuclear weapons depend on whether it is successful or not? If it ends the war in a way that is consistent with Russian war aims, then it would lead to wider proliferation. But if the nuclear use leads to Putin's overthrow or to Russia's defeat, then the result could be less proliferation. So would you agree with that? And coming from East Asia, if you have any thoughts here?
Basically, yeah. But even if Russia does not use nuclear weapons, I think it could go both ways as well. People might say nuclear deterrence worked, but on the other hand, people might say, well, Russia couldn't use nuclear weapons, and deterrence doesn't have any credibility. So because of the fact that Russia was able to invade the neighboring country with nuclear weapons, which enabled nuclear weapons was enabler of the invasion. So we should go for nuclear disarmament. So I think it could go both ways, even if whether or not Russia actually uses nuclear weapons or not.
Certainly. There is a question here from Jess Rogers. We always talk about the need to strengthen norms against use and proliferation. What might be the most effective fora and processes to strengthen those norms? Mariana, you want to go?
I think we do have, over the past few decades, several decades, we've built up plenty of very good and viable international institutions. It's just a matter of kind of leveraging what we have. We have NPT. It's an amazingly, near universal forum. And we have CTBT and CTBTO that needs to be brought into force. So it's a matter of kind of leveraging what we already have. And just to comment on Scott's excellent remark, I think to a certain extent, yes, it does, it does depend on the outcome. But once again, you can never unwind, you can never undo the damage that has already been done with this conventional strike. And I think, countries will be looking at that saying, not only, how can we prevail despite nuclear use, but how can we prevent that from happening in the first place? And I hate saying that because my whole career has been kind of focused on arguing that Ukraine did the right thing, that, it was the strength of the non-proliferation regime and non-proliferation norm, and it's exactly what we should be building up. But I see deterrence as working. I hate to admit it. It is working. NATO is deterred. West is deterred. When Russians say don't interfere, the West doesn't interfere. That to me is a sign that deterrence works. Now, it's harder to argue the other way around, that NATO didn't bomb, Russia didn't bomb NATO supply lines. Maybe that was not their kind of plan in the first place. Maybe they're already struggling to conduct a conventional war with Ukraine. Maybe, opening another front with NATO would not be, otherwise, if it were not for NATO's nuclear weapons, they would otherwise bomb them. I doubt that. That's a harder case to make. But I see the West is deterred. And so, for people or for countries that see this sort of power of deterrence, it might be a very seductive thing, let's put it that way.
Actually, the fact that when you have to fight a war in nuclear shadow, I think it does constrain the contours of that war. And India has discovered that, every time we've been in a crisis with Pakistan, where nuclear weapons are with both the countries, the sense has been that you might have the superior capability, but you do have to look at the consequences of using that capability in a manner that could get the nuclear weapon to be triggered from the other side. So that's the hard reality that all of us confront with this. I have one question on TPNW, Alexander, that I'd ask you, and then there is another question which can perhaps be our last one given our time constraint, which is to the entire panel. But Alexander, to you first. This is about TPNW member states seem to have made the choice not to make TPNW the divisive issue at the NPT RevCon. Do you anticipate this will remain the case through the next review cycle also? Or is a more aggressive approach needed from TPNW states to push nuclear weapon states to more concrete steps towards disarmament?
Well, the argument that the TPNW is divisive for the NPT only came from the opponents of the TPNW. From the opponents of the TPNW. It's very clear from the TPNW states parties that this is in full complementarity with the NPT and fully supportive of the NPT. It's actually been always considered as gravely offensive to the states parties that have pushed the TPNW. Just look at, Ireland has invented the NPT with the Irish resolution, essentially. Mexico has led the entire continent to the nuclear weapon-free zone. South Africa, Kazakhstan, or Austria, these are countries that have very clear track record of support of the NPT. So it was absolutely clear for us, and we actually negotiated in the TPNW framework a very clear paper on the complementarity that really lays it out very clearly. So from our perspective, it's absolutely clear, and we go to the NPT with strong positions on nuclear disarmament, as all of us have had over decades, long before the TPNW came into existence. But it was very clear for us that the TPNW is not a divisive issue. So we simply ask for a very harmless, factual recognition that that's something that happened in the past 7 years. So it was neither a big ask from us nor a big concession that it was in the document, which was then not adopted anyway. So I think that's the way TPNW states, but this will continue in the NPT. We are supportive of the NPT. We want to strengthen both the disarmament side and the non-proliferation aspect. So there is no contradiction whatsoever there from our point of view.
Great. So this is a question for all the panelists, and it just very simply asks, Heather Williams has asked this, do you believe a world without nuclear weapons is more secure than the world that we live in now? And I do remember, in this context, reading a paper by Thomas Schelling, in 2009 in Daedalus, in which he argued that there is a state of nuclear quiescence between US and USSR and Russia. And therefore, there is no need for us to move towards a nuclear weapons-free world. We know what this world looks like. We don't know what a nuclear weapons-free world will be like. And therefore, whether we should move in that direction at all or not. So I think along those lines, Heather is asking, do you believe a world without nuclear weapons is more secure than the world we live in now? And Melanie, if I can start with you.
Thank you, Heather. It's a very good question. And the answer is it depends. And we have to create the conditions for a world without nuclear weapons to be a safer world, actually. And it's really the crux of the problem, that how you get there. And it has something to do with having a transformative agenda of the international order. And it's also a responsibility, especially to the nuclear weapon state, to make that change happen, to have to work for a world that is not just safer, but that is fairer, that is where there is more justice, and where you have solved the geopolitics, making and the very tense situation that we have today. Otherwise, the risk is that you don't have nuclear weapons, but you have very strong incentives to start conflicts with conventional wars, and we have seen that in the past. It can be very, very violent, and we had 2 world wars, unfortunately.
Thank you. Michiru, your thoughts on that?
Yes, so yeah, I want to believe that the world without nuclear weapons would be safer and more secure, but we don't know yet. So as Mariana said, deterrence is working to some extent. Without deterrence, this war could have been much wider spread, much more severe one. So we have to sort of find a connection between the current world with nuclear deterrence to a nuclear world, to a world without nuclear weapons or nuclear deterrence. And there's the need for create this connecting logic that create a world where we can all safely sign TPNW, perhaps in a longer term. So I think we have to be more work together, not pulls apart. Yeah.
Alexander?
It's an important and difficult question, and I think the honest answer is that nobody really knows. And I think it's probably very important to be more humble in this debate anyway, on the acknowledging all the uncertainties and the things that we don't know. The argument goes that without nuclear weapons, conventional conflict would be far more likely. Is that really so? What is really the empirical evidence for it? We don't know. But I think it's actually about weighing. What we do know is that if nuclear deterrence fails, it fails catastrophically for the whole world. So it's ultimately a question of weighing. Yes, there may be more conventional conflict, and that could be horrible, certainly not good. I would say, at the end of the day, the risk of nuclear deterrence is probably too much of a gamble with the security of the whole world, and it has to be. And these assumptions and uncertainties around nuclear deterrence need to be weighed against what we do know. And that is the empirical evidence on what happens if it fails.
If it fails, right.
And it's very difficult. I mean, if it would be easy, we would have solved this issue a long time ago. It's really difficult. But I think the knowledge about consequences and also the better appreciation of risk and the additional risk drivers and the fact that we have multiple nuclear deterrence relationships, all of them are risky. The new technologies, all of that, plus the better understanding of the complexities of an interrelationship of consequences, I think, in my view, very clearly tilt the weighing in the direction we have to find a way out of this paradigm.
Thank you, Mariana. Last 20 words to you.
The world without nuclear weapons is the world without nuclear crises. And it's a world without the specter of nuclear Armageddon and the existential threat to humanity. We do know what the world without nuclear weapons looks like. We lived in that world before 1945 for many, many centuries. Whether the experience of 2 world wars in and of itself might not be enough to deter or prevent another major world war, that's an open question. And I'm not so sure I would be so quick to say that, oh, you know, without nuclear weapons, there would be automatically another world war. What I do see, and that's something Melanie mentioned, is that in this case, you know, in the case where deterrence was not at work, nuclear threats by Russia and nuclear possession by Russia enabled its invasion. The counterfactual is, would Russia have dared to invade Ukraine had it not been a nuclear weapon state? We don't know for sure, but I think more likely not.
Well, that's a thought to that's a thought to end with. And if I can just add my 2 Anna bit to that question about whether that world will be safe or not, and I think it depends on how we get there, the kind of pathway that we carve for ourselves to get to disarmament. Because if we think sitting in today's world about what that world will be like, I think it's very different from the steps that we might, you know, make our way towards disarmament. There were many other questions I was unable to take, but they always say a good session is when you end it with the questions buzzing in everyone's head. So thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure moderating this session, and thank you to all our speakers. Before the next session, please reconvene at 5:15 p.m. in Regency A for the next session on a keynote conversation on